In its 800 years, Oxford University had never witnessed such a profound silence. The Sheldonian Theatre, its golden stone walls steeped in centuries of academic tradition, fell still as Professor Edmund Harrington declared, "Africa has contributed nothing to human civilization." In the front row, Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, rose to his feet. As 500 academics, students, and dignitaries held their breath, no one could have anticipated that his 10-minute response would not only go viral but dismantle Harrington's career and spark a global movement to reclaim Africa's place in history. It was a crisp March afternoon in 2025, and the Sheldonian was packed for a lecture on global leadership in the 21st century, part of Oxford's prestigious African Leadership Series. The theatre's ornate ceiling, painted with allegories of truth and knowledge, loomed over a diverse audience of scholars, diplomats, and students. Ibrahim Traoré, a man of quiet intensity, sat in the front row. Dressed in a tailored dark suit, his face framed by a neatly trimmed beard, he scribbled notes as speakers discussed global cooperation, democratic governance, and sustainable development. His presence was understated, yet his reputation as Burkina Faso's transformative leader preceded him. At 3:30 p.m., Professor Edmund Harrington ascended the stage. In his late 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried the gravitas of a Rhodes Scholar, author of 12 books on European history, and holder of 3 honorary doctorates. His introduction, delivered by a young Oxford don, was glowing, a titan of historical scholarship, a fixture of the university's intellectual elite. As he began his lecture, "The Foundations of Modern Civilization," his tone was authoritative, almost dismissive, as if his conclusions were beyond dispute. "When we examine the pillars of human advancement," Harrington said, his voice reverberating through the historic venue, "a clear pattern emerges. Mathematics sprang from Greece, law from Rome, philosophy from Germany, and industrial innovation from Britain. The foundations of civilization, ladies and gentlemen, are unequivocally Western." He adjusted his glasses, scanning the audience with a faint air of superiority. A few attendees shifted uncomfortably, some African students exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and restraint. Harrington, emboldened by the academic sanctuary that had long shielded such views, pressed on. 20 minutes into his lecture, he delivered the statement that would echo across the world. "Some may point to other continents' contributions," he said, pausing for effect. "Asia gave us gunpowder and paper, the Americas had intricate calendars, but Africa?" A smirk played on his lips. "I challenge anyone in this room to name a single significant contribution to human civilization from sub-Saharan Africa. That continent has been a recipient, not a contributor." The silence that followed was suffocating. In the front row, Traoré closed his leather-bound notebook with deliberate care, placing his pen on the desk beside it. Around him, African students and scholars sat frozen, caught between outrage and the intimidating prospect of confronting a senior professor in Oxford's most hallowed venue. The air grew heavy with unspoken tension, the weight of centuries of erased history pressing down. Then Traoré raised his hand. "Yes," Harrington said, his tone laced with irritation, as if interrupted by an impertinent student. Traoré stood, his movements calm but purposeful. At 41, he carried the quiet authority of a leader who had navigated his nation through turbulent times. "Professor Harrington," he began, his voice clear and resonant despite foregoing the microphone, "I would like to respond to your assertion, if I may." Harrington's smirk widened, a flicker of condescension in his eyes. "By all means, mister." He paused, feigning ignorance of Traoré's identity, though the president had been introduced earlier. "Traoré." "Ibrahim Traoré," he replied, omitting his title as president. "And I accept your challenge." A murmur of anticipation rippled through the audience. Several attendees pulled out their phones, discreetly recording, sensing a historic moment unfolding. Harrington gestured toward the stage with a dismissive wave. "Please, enlighten us. But do try to stick to historical facts, not romantic nationalism." Traoré walked to the podium with measured steps, carrying a simple leather folder. He placed it on the lectern, pausing to survey the audience, students in casual sweaters, professors in academic robes, diplomats in formal attire. Then he turned to Harrington, his gaze steady. "Professor, before I address your challenge, may I ask, in your decades of research, have you visited the manuscript collections of Timbuktu? Studied the mathematical treatises of the Dogon people? Examined the metallurgical techniques of the Haya in Tanzania or the architectural marvels of Great Zimbabwe?" Harrington waved a hand, his tone dripping with disdain. "Ancient mud buildings and primitive folklore hardly constitute civilization, Mr. Traoré. We're discussing contributions to human advancement, not anthropological curiosities." Gasps echoed through the theater at the blatant disrespect. A young African student clenched her fists, while an elderly professor adjusted his glasses, visibly uncomfortable. Traoré, however, remained unshaken. He opened his folder and held up a photocopy of an ancient artifact. "Then let us begin with something you might recognize," he said. "This is the Lebombo bone, discovered in Swaziland 44,000 years old. It bears 29 distinct notches marking lunar cycles, the earliest known mathematical calculations in human history. Mathematics, Professor, did not begin in Greece. It began in Africa." Harrington's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Counting notches is hardly Pythagoras," he scoffed. Traoré pulled out another document, his voice steady. "Then consider the Ishango bone from the Democratic Republic of Congo, 20,000 years old, inscribed with evidence of prime numbers, multiplication, and division. This predates Greek mathematics by 19,000 years. Or let us turn to the University of Sankore in Timbuktu, which in the 12th century housed 700,000 manuscripts and educated 25,000 students at a time when Oxford was still a collection of modest halls. Its scholars wrote on astronomy, law, and medicine while Europe was emerging from the Dark Ages." The audience was now utterly silent, hanging on every word. Traoré's voice grew stronger, yet retained its calm dignity. "You spoke of Roman law. Shall we discuss the Ashanti Confederacy's constitution, established in the 17th century with checks and balances that predate the American Constitution by 3 centuries? Or the Buganda Kingdom's parliamentary system, which practiced sophisticated governance while European monarchs ruled absolutely? You mentioned German philosophy. Have you studied Zara Yacob, the 17th century Ethiopian philosopher whose treatises on rational inquiry and human rights anticipated the Enlightenment? His student, Valda Hewa, wrote ethical works that rivaled anything in Europe, but they were in Gizi, not Latin, so perhaps they are beneath your notice." Harrington attempted to interrupt. "These are isolated examples." Traoré raised a hand, and, remarkably, the professor fell silent. "Isolated, Professor? The Library of Alexandria, founded by the Ptolemaic dynasty of African origin, was the world's greatest repository of knowledge when Europe's ancestors lived in mud huts. African mathematicians calculated the Earth's circumference centuries before Europeans abandoned the flat Earth theory. Medicine? In the 14th century, Malian surgeons performed successful cataract operations. In 1879, Uganda's Bunyoro Kingdom recorded a cesarean section where both mother and child survived, using techniques unknown in Europe for another 50 years. Smallpox variolation, practiced in West Africa and brought to the Americas by enslaved Africans, predated Jenner's vaccine by centuries. He pulled another document from his folder, his voice now resonant with authority. Architecture? The Great Zimbabwe Complex, built in the 11th century, boasts acoustic properties that rival modern engineering. The Nubian pyramids, older than Egypt's, stand as testaments to African ingenuity. Lalabella's rock-hewn churches, carved from single volcanic slabs in the 12th century, defy modern engineering. Metallurgy? The Haya people of Tanzania produced carbon steel in blast furnaces 2,000 years ago, a technique Europe wouldn't match until the Industrial Revolution. The Benin bronzes were so sophisticated that Europeans, unable to believe Africans created them, fabricated tales of lost Portuguese craftsmen. Traoré's words flowed like a river, each fact a stone building an unassailable case. Agriculture? Africans domesticated millet, sorghum, African rice, yams, black-eyed peas, watermelon, and okra. The Sahel's irrigation systems sustained cities of hundreds of thousands while Europe languished in the Dark Ages. The Dogon's terraced agriculture has supported communities for over a millennium in conditions where European methods fail within a season. The fractal geometry embedded in African textiles and architecture predates Mandelbrot's theories by centuries. Music? The call-and-response traditions of African griots laid the foundation for jazz, blues, rock, and nearly all modern popular music. He paused, locking eyes with Harrington, who was now visibly sweating despite the theater's cool air. But perhaps most profound is Ubuntu, the philosophy of I am because we are. While European thought fixated on individual rights and conquest, African philosophy developed restorative justice, collective responsibility, and human dignity, concepts the so-called civilized world is only now beginning to grasp. Traoré held up a final document, his voice softening but piercing. This, Professor, is a letter from Cecil Rhodes, founder of the scholarship that may have funded your education. It explicitly calls for suppressing African history to justify colonization. Your ignorance is not accidental. It is the product of a deliberate, centuries-long effort to erase African contributions. For 47 years, you have perpetuated that erasure. The silence in the theater was absolute. Harrington stood at the stage's edge, his mouth opening and closing, words failing him. Traoré continued, his tone resolute. I could speak for hours, Professor. I could describe the Dogon's astronomical knowledge of Sirius B, invisible to the naked eye, documented centuries before Western telescopes. I could discuss the Swahili coast's maritime trade networks, which connected Africa to Asia and the Middle East while Europe was still insular. I could highlight the Mali Empire's economic system, which controlled global gold markets in the Middle Ages. But I believe I've made my point. He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. The question isn't whether Africa contributed to civilization. It's why you, a professor at one of the world's most prestigious universities, either don't know these facts, or, worse, know them and choose to deny them. A young African woman in the third row clapped first, her hands trembling with emotion. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, the theater erupted in thunderous applause. Students stood, followed by professors, then even reluctant administrators. The sound swelled, filling the historic space. Professor Mary Whitfield, an elderly white scholar and head of African studies, rose from the front row. Her voice, amplified by her microphone, cut through the applause. Mr. President, she said, acknowledging Traoré's title for the first time, as a member of this institution, I apologize. Your words have exposed a shameful blind spot in our curriculum. I move that Oxford immediately review and revise our history programs to include the African contributions you've outlined. The applause surged again, louder still. Harrington, isolated on the stage's edge, searched desperately for allies but found none. His decades of authority had dissolved in 10 minutes. Traoré spoke once more, his voice quiet but resonant. I seek not apologies but truth. Human civilization is not the property of one continent or race. It is the culmination of all human achievement, from the first mathematical notches on an African bone to the latest scientific discovery. But as long as scholars like Dr. Harrington teach a deliberately incomplete history, we perpetuate ignorance and prejudice. Today, we have a choice: continue the lies or embrace the full, rich, complex truth. He gathered his papers and stepped down from the podium. As he passed Harrington, he paused. Professor, he said softly, yet loud enough for the microphones to catch, I've left copies of these sources with your department. I hope you'll find time to read them. The response was seismic. Within hours, videos titled, African President Dismantles Racist Oxford Professor, and The Most Epic Takedown in Academic History, flooded social media, amassing tens of millions of views by morning. News outlets from Lagos to London, Nairobi to New York, covered the story. African scholars worldwide corroborated Traoré's points, adding examples. The Aksum Empire's coinage system, which predated most European currencies, the Songhai Empire's legal codes, the Congo Kingdom's diplomatic correspondence with Europe in the 15th century. The hashtag Africa Built Civilization trended globally for weeks. The next day, Harrington issued a brief statement announcing his early retirement to pursue personal interests. Oxford University released a formal apology, committing to a comprehensive review of its history curriculum. The Sheldonian Theatre, once the stage for Harrington's remarks, was designated to host an annual lecture series on African contributions to global civilization, with Traoré invited as its inaugural speaker. The impact rippled far beyond Oxford. Enrollment in African studies programs surged across British and European universities. Young historians traveled to Africa, poring over Timbuktu's manuscripts, studying Dogon astronomical records, and documenting traditional medical practices. Universities in Africa, from Ibadan to Addis Ababa, saw renewed interest in their archives. The Malian government launched a global campaign to digitize and share Timbuktu's manuscripts, while Ethiopian scholars published new translations of Zara Yacob's works. A year later, Oxford unveiled a statue in its main quadrangle, not of Traoré, who humbly declined the honor, but of Ahmed Baba al-Timbukti, the 16th-century scholar whose 1,600 books on law, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics educated generations while Oxford was still in its infancy. The inscription read, "Knowledge has no color, wisdom has no continent, truth belongs to all humanity." In a reflective interview years later, Traoré spoke of that day. "I didn't go to Oxford intending to give that speech," he said, his voice steady. "But when Professor Harrington spoke, I thought of African children who might hear such lies and believe them. I thought of the countless African minds, scholars, inventors, healers, whose contributions were erased or stolen. I couldn't remain silent. The tragedy isn't one professor's ignorance, it's that his views were deemed acceptable in an institution dedicated to truth. How many students sat through his lectures over 47 years, absorbing those prejudices? How many now hold positions of power, carrying those biases? I spoke not to humiliate him but to break that cycle." When asked if his response was too harsh, Traoré shook his head. "For centuries, African history has been written by those who enslaved, colonized, and exploited us. They had no interest in our achievements. When your history has been denied for so long, speaking truth isn't harsh, it's necessary." Harrington had 47 years to learn. He chose ignorance. I chose not to let it stand. The Traoré Moment, as it became known, is now a cornerstone of academic discourse on African history, studied in universities worldwide. It serves as a testament to the power of truth, delivered with dignity and backed by irrefutable facts, to dismantle prejudice. From Lagos to London, Cairo to Cape Town, classrooms now begin African history lessons with a simple, once controversial truth. Africa is not just part of human civilization, it is where it began. That March afternoon's silence marked not just the end of one professor's career but the dawn of a long overdue reckoning about whose stories are told, whose achievements are recognized, and whose contributions to humanity are remembered.